Hello everyone. In today's video we are going to talk about how to write the critical response for this class. And here up on Cobra, again, here's the packet for it that you can click here and then download it to your computer. And as I go through it, like I did with the summary, I will highlight some of the important parts as we go through it. So in our last video we looked at summarizing the article that you read, and so that is basically putting the author's major points into your own words. It didn't mean that you agreed with it or not, it's just that you were acknowledging what the author said. And so once you've done that, once you understood what the author read, now you're going to reflect on your own thoughts. Okay, so here you're going to talk about your opinion, your attitude, your reasons for agreeing or not. In fact, even during reading, you may have taken those annotations, those notes, as reactions to the author. So that's why it's good to have those annotations, because then those are things that you can look back on and use when you have to write your summary and critical response. So if summarizing helps you comprehend and recall, what reflecting does in a critical response is it helps us weave into our memory truly and completely, so that you're going to remember this article and the points made. Okay, so how do you write a critical response? There's several different approaches to it. The obvious one is you're going to agree, disagree, qualify, or extend the author's ideas. You can add additional examples to provide further elaboration on what the author is saying. So those could be an example from your own life that might work in comparing to what the author wrote about. You can describe other related issues that the essay made you think about. So maybe they didn't necessarily touch on another issue, but it made you think about something else that you learned in a previous class. And then you can compare what you used to think about the topic with what you think now. Okay, and that's very important, especially this semester when we talk about wrongful convictions, because you might be coming into this class not knowing a lot, not knowing anything, and once we read our first article about wrongful convictions and then our book, that may greatly change. And so that's something that you can really reflect in your critical response. You can show practical uses or application of the author's main ideas, and then you could answer the question, what would happen if, to further the possibilities. Okay, so those are all really good examples of what you can do. Now the summary was a fourth of the original text. Okay, so for our summary for how to mark a book, that was about half a page typed. For the critical essay, it's going to be 1 to 2 pages, okay? Because you have 4 paragraphs to write. And I've got an example up here, so as we talk about what to do in each paragraph, we're going to take a look at the example paragraph. So paragraph number 1, you're going to introduce the article and title. That includes the author's name along with the title of the article, okay? Oops. All right, and so here you're going to include the author's name, the title of the article, and you want to choose one point they made in the article. So in How to Mark a Book, they talked about a lot of different topics. So what is one that you want to talk about? Okay, so let's take a look down here below of an example of an introduction here. Okay, so remember, author's name, title of article, in quotes, all the important words capitalized. And we're focusing on one point. So in our example here it says, in The Old Man, Larry King tells the story of his adolescent rebellion against his father. He makes the point that he eventually realized that even though he and his father had different values, he still loved his father. So that's the point he wants to talk about, reflect upon. And now he gives an example of what Larry King said about that. When he was 18, he left his home in Midland, Texas, and joined the Army. On a visit home, however, he realized that he was very much connected to his father. He ends the piece by describing the touching moment he left his father when his furlough was over. I knew then that I loved him too, and had, even in the worst times, and would never stop. And so that's your author's name, the title of the article, and then what was the one point you want to talk about from that piece. Okay, so that is paragraph number 1. Paragraph number 2 is where you state a personal connection, okay, from your own life experiences, something that you're comfortable with sharing. And I've had a lot of interesting experiences that students have written about, and their critical responses that I've learned about, that I have enjoyed reading. So for this one, this is how they connect it back to them. I understand the author's rebellion against his father. When I was a teenager, I went through the same feelings with my own father. His main objective as a parent was to protect me, while my goal was to explore my options. For example, he didn't want me to leave my home state to go to graduate school. Earlier, he had not wanted me to take up the flute and join the band. Even during my senior year, he was always concerned lest I stay up too late studying. Like Larry, I eventually realized that even though we had our obvious differences, I had always loved him and would dread the time when I would be without him. So here at the end, this is really good. Just this little bit, like Larry, the author, he is connecting his own experience back to what the point was that he pulled out of Larry King's essay. So that's good. At the end of this paragraph, you link it back to what the main point of that article is that you're talking about. All right, so that's paragraph number 2. Paragraph number 3, we're going to develop beyond ourselves, okay? So take a look at what you've read, whether it's in this class or another class or on your own, movies and the news and social media, anything and everything. Connect it back to another example. And so he does that with something that he read about someone else's life. And this is kind of a little surprising, but this is how he connected back to someone else. In addition to my own experience, I've read about Richard Wright's feelings of resentment toward his father. In Wright's case, he resented his authoritarian father so much that he chose to rebel at an early age. One time he took advantage of his father by taking him literally when the father said to kill a kitten that was disturbing his sleep. Richard actually hung the kitten and then claimed to his father that he was just doing what he'd been told. Richard thought he'd sent a message to his father that he couldn't be punished. So here, moving beyond yourself, you connect it back to something else. And then finally, number 4 is your conclusion. Okay? And it's just a short conclusion, nothing fancy. And so here's the example they used here, which is fine. Based on my reading of autobiographical articles, such as Larry King's, I think my own experience of rebellion is fairly typical of parent-child relationship. Even though the child rebels or chooses different values, the child usually comes to understand that the bond of love is strong. So here they're just kind of ending it, based on what I've read and my own experiences. They're kind of showing the connection between their own experiences and the point that they chose from that reading. Okay, so that is a critical response. And so you can see double space, font size 12, it's a little over a page typed. Okay, and I've had ones that they've gone into more detail, and that's fine. I always enjoy reading what you have to say about a topic. And so this second paragraph with your own personal experience, maybe that goes into 2 paragraphs. That's fine. Maybe if you're connecting it back to something you've seen in the news or something, maybe it takes 2 paragraphs, and I'm okay with that. But definitely make sure your introduction, it has the author's name and the article, the title of the article. Okay, so remember the citation and the summary needed all 4 parts: the author's name, title of the article, title of the source, and the date. But for the critical response, you just need the 2, the author's name and article title. And then in that introduction, you're going to pick out 1 point that you want to make, what you want to talk about from that piece. Paragraph 2, connect it back to your own experience. And then paragraph 3, connect it to beyond yourself. And then for your quick conclusion. So let's take a look at what we can say then about the current article that you read in week 1. So if we go back here and take a look. So they said a number of different kinds of things. So they talked about on the first page, there's 2 ways in which you can own a book. They talked about 3 kinds of book owners. So maybe if you really like to read, You want to talk about which one you fall under. In the second page, they talked about reasons why it's important to mark up your book. So maybe you want to talk about how it keeps you awake as you read, in any of those. And then on the second page, or the third page, it talks about specifically what you can do. So maybe in your second paragraph, you talk about, I've never done this before. And before I got to college, I myself never annotated anything, because a lot of the time when you had textbooks or anything like that in high school in K through 12, they were the school's property. So you weren't allowed to write in those. So I never really learned annotation myself. It was something that I kind of learned on my own, since when I go to college and you go to college, you own your books and everything. And so in the second paragraph, I could talk about, hey, I've never done this before, and then how now you're starting to see what annotations can do for you and how they can help you. And then anything with speed. He says speed doesn't mean anything. So maybe that was something growing up that you worried about, because you thought that you needed to read faster, and so that would make your understanding better. Okay, so any of those would work. So I'm going to type up an example, a short example one, in video number 2 for going over the critical response.